I never imagined I'd be telling this story. Not at 62, and definitely not after giving nearly 2 decades of my life to a company I helped build from the ground up. My name is John Campbell, and for 15 years, I was the Chief Financial Officer of Raven Tech. That company, those spreadsheets, forecasts, budget meetings, late nights with nothing but black coffee and ledger books to keep me company, they were my life. I joined Raven Tech when it was still known as Raven Technologies, a small family-owned operation clinging to life with 2 outdated factories in Duluth and Rochester. They had one decent client, a bare-bones workforce, and books that looked more like guesswork than accounting. But despite the chaos, I saw something in it, something salvageable. Maybe it was the pride in the founder's voice, or maybe it was just the challenge. Whatever it was, I signed on, knowing it would be an uphill battle. And it was. For years. I wasn't the kind of executive you'd see speaking at conferences or making flashy statements in Forbes. I didn't care much for public attention or networking events. I cared about accuracy, integrity, and keeping the company solvent. While others were selling big visions, I was the guy in the back room making sure our numbers weren't lying. I cleaned up the books first, tightened up expenses, renegotiated supplier contracts, introduced automation into our budgeting processes. Then I worked with our COO to streamline manufacturing. We phased out waste, invested in scalable infrastructure, and I personally vetted every dollar we spent. I remember the day we broke even for the first time. It was year 3. I didn't say much, just nodded to myself and went back to my desk. But that night, I stayed late and poured myself a small glass of bourbon. I wasn't much of a drinker, but that sip tasted like victory. What followed were the best years of my life. Revenues climbed, slowly at first, then faster. We opened new branches in Chicago, Denver, Austin. I led the financials for our IPO in year 9, hell of a process, and more stress than I care to remember, but we pulled it off. I kept us compliant, clean, and transparent in a world where companies like ours were constantly tempted to fudge the truth to impress Wall Street. I never did. I never had to. People started noticing me then. I got offers from bigger firms, tech giants, financial firms, even a couple of government positions. But I stayed. Raven Tech had become more than a job. It was mine. Not in title, not in ownership, but in heart. It felt like something I could pass down, like a legacy. Then, just over 6 months ago, everything changed. His name was Alex Rogers. The board called him a once-in-a-generation talent. I called him a disruption dressed in a $3,000 suit. 36 years old, Harvard MBA, venture capital background, and a jawline that seemed like it was made for magazine covers. The guy talked like a podcast episode, always about unlocking potential and reinventing verticals. He walked into the company headquarters like he owned the place, even though he'd never so much as walked a factory floor in his life. To be fair, the board didn't bring him in blindly. The company had plateaued, growth was steady, but not exciting. Our stock was consistent, not sexy. And in the world of public companies, stable doesn't get applause. They wanted energy. Youth. Disruption. And they got it. Alex's first week was all smiles and town halls. He gave out buzzwords like Halloween candy, synergy, transformation, scalability. The younger employees ate it up. Some of the older ones, the ones who'd been around as long as I had, weren't so sure. But they stayed quiet. So did I, at first. It wasn't my job to fight change. I'd seen CEOs come and go. My job was to keep the numbers honest, keep the ship steady while others steered. But with Alex, something felt different. He didn't come to me during his onboarding. No sit down, no overview of our financials. That was my first red flag. Instead, he started pulling in outside consultants, brand strategists, growth architects, whatever that meant. I watched as he moved quickly, introducing new reporting tools without consulting finance, shifting budgets from operations to marketing without a whisper of explanation. I didn't panic. I just took notes. At first, I told myself he was just being aggressive. Young CEO syndrome. A desire to prove himself. But something about his approach didn't sit right with me. He wasn't just shaking things up, he was ignoring the very structure that had kept Raventech honest. He'd roll out a new initiative on Monday, then demand numbers by Wednesday. When we asked what success metrics to use, he'd wave it off. "You're the finance guy, John. Make it look good. Make it look good." That phrase haunted me. It was the first time in 15 years anyone had suggested presentation over substance. And it wouldn't be the last. I found myself lying awake more often. Not out of fear, but frustration. The company I'd helped build was suddenly moving in directions I didn't recognize. It wasn't about long-term vision anymore. It was about headlines. Quarterly bumps. Impressions. Optics. Still, I kept my head down. I did what I always did, ran the numbers, double-checked the forecasts, kept my spreadsheets clean and my suspicions to myself. But the more I watched Alex operate, the more I started to wonder if the very legacy I'd spent a decade and a half building, was about to be torn down in a matter of months. Everything started to shift the moment Alex Rogers walked through the doors of Raventech. He didn't just arrive, he made an entrance. 36 years old, sharp suit, sharper smile, and a LinkedIn profile that read like it had been curated by a branding agency. Harvard MBA. Venture capital darling. Spoke in phrases like synergizing talent pipelines and unlocking vertical innovation. You get the idea. The board welcomed him like a golden ticket. A breath of fresh air, they said. New blood to take us to the next level. I heard it all. Sat through the meetings. Smiled when I was supposed to. But in the back of my mind, I already knew what this meant, change for the sake of optics. At first, I stayed out of the way. I'd seen CEOs come and go. Most eventually settled into the rhythm of the company, learned its language, respected its culture. But Alex? He came in swinging. One of his first moves was to bring in a consulting firm from the West Coast, Innovation Architects, whatever that meant. They were given unrestricted access to our leadership teams, bypassing procurement and even legal. I found out about it from an internal calendar invite I was never looped into. He started restructuring budgets, reallocating funds without clear justification. Marketing spending doubled overnight, and a slew of new, strategic partners appeared on our vendor list, companies none of us had ever worked with before. No history, no vetting, just fast-tracked into the system. I tried to bring it up, gently at first. Just curious about some of these vendors, I said during a finance check-in. Alex smiled and waved it off. We're streamlining. Accelerating where it counts. Old processes are slowing us down. Streamlining. Right. But what bothered me wasn't just the changes, it was how effortlessly he dismissed the systems we'd built. Processes that had been carefully refined over years were now labeled outdated. People who'd given decades to the company were suddenly being pushed into advisory roles or offered early retirement packages. Meanwhile, his new hires, young, overconfident, and loyal to him, were taking over key departments. They didn't ask questions. They followed his lead. They were more focused on optics than outcomes. The financial red flags started showing up soon after. An invoice from a creative agency listed a 5-day campaign analysis for $90,000, with no deliverables, no summary report. Another vendor, Lofton Partners, received a consulting retainer 3 days after it was registered as a business. When I searched the address, it turned out to be a mailbox rental. I flagged them internally. Quietly. Discreetly. I wasn't looking to pick a fight, just trying to keep things from going off the rails. But the responses I got were always the same: it's been approved, Alex signed off, don't worry about it. The deeper I looked, the more inconsistencies I found. Contracts that skipped legal review. Payments routed through holding companies. Projects that existed only on paper. During one leadership sync, I tried again. I'm noticing some unusual vendor activity, I said, careful with my tone. We may want to take a closer look before year-end. Alex didn't even glance at me. That's why we have modern finance tools, he said. Let's not get bogged down in micromanagement. Micromanagement. That's what he called oversight. That night, I stayed late, long after everyone else had gone home. I walked through the empty halls, past the framed photos of company milestones, the IPO, our first international branch, the year we hit $1 billion in revenue. Moments I had helped make happen. And now? Now it felt like none of it mattered. Like the foundation I helped build was being quietly chipped away, replaced with flash over substance. As I turned off the lights in my office, I caught a glimpse of the new mission statement someone had posted in the lobby. Speed. Disruption. Vision. It used to say, integrity. Growth. Resilience. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't just a new CEO. It was the beginning of something I couldn't afford to ignore. By the start of the third month, I stopped pretending things would course-correct. It was no longer about flashy consultants or awkward slogans on the walls. There were numbers that didn't match. Patterns that couldn't be explained away with jargon. And the more I dug, the less sense any of it made. It started small. A budget request from marketing showed up with inflated figures for a digital expansion campaign. Nothing unusual on the surface, except that the vendor listed didn't match any approved supplier in our system. I ran the name through our supplier registry. Nothing. I Googled it. Still nothing, just a bare-bones website with a logo, a contact email, and a tagline that said something like "Innovation with Integrity." I flagged it to Alex's new operations coordinator, a guy named Travis, who looked like he had just walked off a college campus. "Yeah, that's one of our new strategic vendors," he said casually, sipping his smoothie. "Alex wants to keep things agile." "Agile is fine," I said. "But this vendor isn't on the books." "Who vetted them?" He shrugged. "I think they were fast-tracked. Vision alignment or something." I didn't push. Not right then. But I made a note of it. Then it happened again, twice in the same week. Another vendor. Another contract. Another round of payments approved without proper procurement oversight. By the end of the week, I had a small folder on my desk labeled gray area. Inside, 6 contracts, 5 shell companies, and more than $2.4 million in payments that didn't follow protocol. No paper trail. No points of contact. No red flags in the accounting system, because someone had figured out how to bury them just deep enough. I wasn't accusing anyone. Not yet. But I knew I wasn't imagining it. The finance team had changed too. 2 of my longest-serving analysts had been reassigned to departments that didn't even need them. Their replacements were young, ambitious, and, conveniently, loyal to Alex. One of them, a kid named Brandon, had once asked me if we really needed to reconcile every ledger line by hand when software could make it disappear faster. Make it disappear. That's what he said. I started working longer hours. Quiet hours, after everyone else had gone home, when I could comb through the ledgers without distraction. It became a habit, one I kept to myself. I wasn't just doing it to stay ahead. I was doing it because I didn't trust anyone anymore. And that's when I noticed the names. Supplier accounts with initials instead of real business names. Contracts signed off by proxies. Entities formed just weeks before getting approved for high-value projects. It was all too neat, too deliberate. Like someone wanted it to look boring, to keep it just under the threshold of suspicion. So I did what I've always done when something didn't feel right. I documented everything. I made copies of invoices, cross-checked them against payment approvals, highlighted line items that didn't add up. I built a spreadsheet of every questionable transaction, timestamped it, and saved it on a flash drive I kept in my briefcase, never the company network. I wasn't paranoid. I was being careful. Because by that point, it wasn't about being right. It was about being safe. One night, while reviewing consultant invoices, I came across a payment to a company called Novascope Strategies. I'd never heard of it, and no one had mentioned it during any leadership meetings. The invoice listed a 1-month engagement for organizational culture diagnostics at a cost of $175,000. No deliverables attached. No final report filed. That same week, Alex flew out to Palm Springs for what he called a strategy retreat. Coincidence? Maybe. But that's the problem with coincidences in finance, they tend to be expensive. I asked around discreetly. No one seemed to know who had authorized the contract. Legal was never looped in. HR hadn't participated. I even reached out to the listed consultant via the email on the invoice, but it bounced. I'll never forget the pit in my stomach that night. I went home, sat in the dark kitchen, and stared at my reflection in the window above the sink. For the first time since I started at Raven Tech, I felt like a stranger in my own company. Worse, I felt like a liability. That weekend, I drove up to the lake cabin I'd been fixing up for retirement. I told my wife it was just to get some quiet time, maybe clear my head. In truth, I needed to get those documents off-site. I brought a second flash drive and locked it in a safe I'd kept up there for years, mostly filled with old tax returns and sentimental junk. But now, it held something else. Something dangerous. On Monday morning, back at HQ, Alex was waiting for me outside the elevator. "John," he said, clapping me on the back. "I've been meaning to catch you. We've got a new consulting group flying in this week. You'll love them, super disruptive thinkers." I forced a smile. "Can't wait." He leaned in, his voice dropping just enough to make the hairs on my neck rise. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" I nodded slowly. "Just staying focused." He studied me for a second. "Too long." And then that same smile snapped back into place. "That's what I love about you, John. Steady hands. Let's catch up later this week." As he walked off, I felt a chill crawl up my spine. He knew. Not everything, maybe, but enough to be watching me now. So I watched him back. I didn't sleep much after that. Each night I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations, emails, receipts. My instincts weren't just tingling anymore, they were screaming. Something was happening inside Raven Tech. Something calculated, coordinated, and deeply wrong. And no one else seemed to notice. Or worse, they noticed and didn't care. So I doubled down. I started using a burner laptop, one I picked up at a pawn shop 2 towns over. I didn't connect it to the company network. I didn't log in with any Raven Tech credentials. Every document, every screenshot, every anomaly I uncovered went onto that machine. I organized everything by vendor, date, and approver. I cross-referenced shell companies with business registries and found 3 entities, Citron Group, RZT Solutions, and Lofton Partners, all registered to the same office suite in Delaware. And all within 6 weeks of Alex stepping into the CEO role. Fake companies. Real money. It felt surreal at first. Like I was watching a thriller unfold from the outside. But I wasn't watching, I was in it. And the people I worked with every day, the ones who smiled in meetings and sent out company-wide pep emails, some of them were in on it. Or at least, they were benefiting from it. One morning, while reviewing vendor payment cycles, I found a quarterly transfer of $3.1 million labeled Advanced Retainer, for a vendor that didn't even have an EIN listed in our records. That's not just a mistake. That's a placeholder. A way to park funds in plain sight. I started asking questions, quietly. I scheduled informal chats with folks I trusted, logistics analysts, procurement staff, and one old friend from compliance. I didn't tell them what I was doing. I just asked general questions. Had they noticed anything unusual, any new approvals that skipped the normal flow? Most shrugged it off. One, a junior auditor named Mia, gave me a curious look and said, "Funny you asked. I tried flagging something 2 weeks ago, but the request was closed before I even submitted the report. Said it was resolved by executive direction." That phrase chilled me. Not just because it was vague, but because I had seen it before, in an internal memo signed off by one of Alex's assistants. I documented it all. Every email I could get my hands on. Every financial report with discrepancies. I even screen captured internal Slack messages, harmless on the surface, but when strung together, they told a story of something much bigger than creative accounting. And I was careful. Extremely careful. I didn't keep the burner laptop in the office. I left it locked in my car during the day, hidden under a false panel in the trunk. At home, I stored the data on encrypted USB drives and backed up everything twice, once to an offline hard drive, and once on a password-protected cloud account under a dummy name. I wasn't taking chances. There was a moment, about a month into my deep dive, when I almost backed off. Not because I doubted what I was finding, but because I started seeing how far it went. If I was right, this wasn't just creative bookkeeping or a few shady deals. It was systemic. Coordinated. Possibly criminal. And I knew what that meant. If I took this all the way, it would mean going up against Alex. Against the board. Against the company I had poured my life into. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, a glass of water in front of me, laptop open to a spreadsheet that told a story no one else wanted to hear. My wife walked in and placed a hand on my shoulder. "You okay?" she asked. I hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Just thinking." She gave me a knowing look. "You've been doing that a lot lately." I looked at her, really looked. For years, she'd supported my long hours, my stress, my obsession with clean numbers and solid reports. But this was different. This wasn't just work. It was a risk. A line I couldn't uncross. "Whatever it is," she said quietly, "do what you know is right." That stayed with me. So I kept going. I printed out hard copies, enough to fill a binder, all labeled and organized. I made a duplicate set and left it at the cabin, sealed in a fireproof box beneath the floorboards. I even mailed a third version to a lawyer friend I trusted, with a note that simply said, "Open if anything happens to me." Paranoid? Maybe. But I'd read too many headlines about whistleblowers who got handled. Then came the kicker. One of the vendors, Citron Group, was listed as having received a large payment routed through an intermediary account based in the Cayman Islands. That payment was broken into several smaller wires, none over $10,000. Structuring. Classic laundering tactic. That's when it stopped being internal corruption. That's when it became fraud. The last board meeting of my career came and went without a whisper of recognition. No thank you, no handshake, no final slide with my photo and a 15 years of service banner. Just a silent agenda item, CFO transition update. A younger man with a bright tie and a resume full of buzzwords took my seat at the table as if it had never belonged to me. I wasn't even asked to speak. Just nodded at once, by the chair, as if I were some piece of furniture being quietly hauled off stage. I sat through it with a straight face. I even took notes, knowing full well I'd never read them again. But inside, I was done. Not just with Raven Tech, but with the illusion that integrity meant anything to the people now running it. When the meeting ended, I stood slowly, smoothed my tie, and gathered my binder. No one looked up. No one followed me out. I walked past the reception desk, past the hallway portraits they hadn't taken down yet, photos of past executives, founders, milestones I had helped make happen. At the far end of the hall, through the glass, I saw Alex giving a tour of my office to his entourage. They laughed about something. One of them pointed at the view. Another sat casually on my old desk like it was a piece of stage decor. I stood there for a second, invisible. Then I walked out without saying a word. That night, at home, I opened my laptop one last time. I had everything ready: documents, spreadsheets, contracts, bank routing information, even anonymized whistleblower letters I'd drafted but never sent. The data wasn't just compelling. It was airtight. Dozens of transactions tied to shell companies, routed through offshore accounts, signed off under obscure executive privileges. It was theft. Dressed in suits and smiles and press releases, but theft, plain and simple. I didn't call the press. I didn't post on social media. That wasn't my way. I sent a single encrypted file to the Financial Crimes Division of the SEC, flagged urgent, insider activity. I attached no signature. No whistleblower name. Just a note. Raven Tech is not what it appears. Start with Novascope and Citron Group. Trace the routing numbers. Follow the consultant contracts. Then I clicked send. It was done. I spent the next few days in limbo, part of me waiting for a knock on the door, the other part hoping maybe I'd dreamed it all. But then, like clockwork, it began. Quiet at first. A request from the SEC for supplemental documentation. Then another. I responded anonymously, using the encrypted channels they provided. Within 3 weeks, the investigation was officially underway. Emails were pulled. Accounts frozen. Depositions quietly scheduled. I watched from a distance as the company I had helped grow was dissected piece by piece, not with malice, but with the cold efficiency I had once admired in myself. Alex tried to play it cool at first. Publicly, he framed it as a routine audit. But when the subpoenas started hitting his inner circle, that cool exterior began to crack. He canceled a conference appearance. His social media activity dropped off. Eventually, he stopped showing up at the office altogether. By the end of the quarter, Raven Tech issued a statement citing financial irregularities under review. The board launched an internal investigation. Shareholders demanded answers. And quietly, behind closed doors, Alex Rogers resigned for personal reasons. No charges had been filed yet, not officially, but I knew it was coming. The evidence was too strong. I'd made sure of that. And me? I packed up my things, drove up to my cabin in the mountains, and turned off my phone for 2 full weeks. No Wi-Fi. No news. Just wind, trees, and the sound of my breath finally slowing down. It took a while to remember who I was without spreadsheets and quarterly forecasts. But slowly, I settled into a different rhythm. I started volunteering with a local nonprofit that provided financial literacy to rural schools. Helped them clean up their books, teach budgeting classes. It wasn't glamorous. But it was honest. And that mattered. Sometimes people ask me if I regret it, blowing the whistle, walking away, watching the company unravel after everything I put into it. And I tell them the truth, I regret not doing it sooner. I spent 15 years protecting something I thought was unshakable. But in the end, it wasn't the building or the logo or the stock price that meant anything. It was the people who showed up every day trying to do their jobs with decency and pride. The ones who trusted that someone like me was keeping the machine honest. And I did. Right up until the very end.